Heather Gracie, Joe Barkley, Commissioner Charlie Justice, myself, staff and Brad are here. And we're going to call to order our legislative committee meeting of October 21st, and it's just a little after 1 o'clock. So I apologize for the delay. There's no public here to comment, so let's approve the first action item, which is 3A, our August 9th and September 10th minutes of our meeting.
Move approval. Second.
It's been moved and approved. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right. And 3B is our 2020 legislative priorities. Brad.
All right, so thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Ron and Alan, I think you're on the phone, and I was recommending that you guys go first. I just tried. I've never done this, so maybe Clarissa or Rachel, you might think I did it wrong. I tried through Grandcast just to send you the priorities that we're talking about now. And I think you can get
I got it.
Yep, we have it. Yeah, I got it as well.
Oh, you got it. Amazing. My computer skills are getting better. I fixed Joe's iPad, I think, at the Finance Committee, didn't I? Yeah. So, oh, hello.
Hi.
Commissioner Driscoll is here.
Welcome.
So the schedule that we're following is to have the PSTA full board on Wednesday morning vote to approve our 2020 state and federal legislative priorities. And in your packets are a very basic Microsoft Word version of the legislative priorities that we're recommending for the state of Florida, and then in Washington, D.C. is the second page. Once the PSTA board approves a set of priorities, we will then convert that into a more attractive looking one-page document that's what we take with us to Tallahassee and to Washington, D.C. to with our government advocacy partners and talk to our delegation and other members of the legislature to see how far we can advance those items. Thanks to Ron Pierce and Natalie King and Alan Seski for getting a couple of meetings locally with some of the Pinellas State delegation, that we've already shared this list and kind of modified it a little bit based on their feedback. But if you just take a look at the state legislative priorities, I'll just quickly outline them, and then Ron and Alan, you can chime in on anything you've heard that you recommend on these. As you can see, it's largely related to two topics: electric bus infrastructure and electric vehicle infrastructure, and our transportation disadvantage program. The number one priority that we're recommending is number one, TD proviso language. Essentially what that means relates to is the formula which allocates the state transportation disadvantage dollars across all counties in the state of Florida. Changed this last legislative session because the legislature decided not to approve the proviso language that they had included for the last couple of years based on a study that PSTA was involved in sponsoring to modify the formula in which transportation disadvantage dollars were allocated to reflect increased demand, where people with that were transportation disadvantaged lived. The new formula prioritized that a little bit more than the old formula did, which allocated more funds to each county, including more funds to rural counties. The legislature didn't include the transportation, the proviso this last session like they had done the last 2 years. And so we're asking that the proviso language be re-included in the 2020 funds, that would benefit PSTA, Pinellas County's allocation by about $200,000 more than we're gonna receive this year. And we lost about 200K in this current year from last year.
Just by the language change?
Yeah, just because they went back to using the old formula. Now, of course, the better thing to do would be to have the new formula be taken out of proviso language and permanently put into Florida code. And the Commission for Transportation Disadvantaged new executive director, who I met with in a couple weeks ago, said that the commission is going to investigate doing that. So there's a possibility that they will recommend going ahead and including the new formula in code. But the thought from at least my brethren on the Florida Public Transit Association was going through the state's processes to change the code takes a long time and probably wouldn't be done by the legislative session. So it might need another session of proviso language. So that's number one.
Hey, Brad, this is Alan. Ron and I actually talked last week, and just to give everybody some additional context on the proviso change, I had an impromptu meeting last week with some other folks who are interested in this issue, and they were, it was pointed out that obviously we've been very involved in it as well. So we got together, and part of the challenge, and I think there's a solution, and Ron and I kind of discussed this. The challenge is that the TD, the proviso for the 2 years that was included, was paid for essentially by the money that I think we'll all remember Miami-Dade was sending money back every year. So the legislature used those additional dollars that were being sent back to pay for that proviso change. Miami-Dade, that money is essentially running out or has run out. And so the proviso change, I don't think, is going to be the challenge. I think what the legislature, and particularly staff, and this is really a staff level issue, what they are trying to identify is where to pull that money from, if they include the proviso going forward, either whether that be permanent or even temporary as in this year. So there's been some discussion on a couple of funds that have some leftover money. When you look at the trends, there are a couple of funds within DOT that are eligible for this that they could pull from. So I think there's some general support, especially in some of the rural areas, to change it back to the way we would like it as well. Some folks who would be on our side of that fight. And I think the challenge right now is just identifying the funding source, but I think I think it's becoming a larger issue because we talked about, in Senator Hudson's district, who chairs TED in the Senate, one of his counties lost more money than we did. So I think there's becoming this kind of tidal wave of folks who are saying, hey, let's find the long-term solution, but in the interim, let's make sure that we go back to this way of doing things over the last couple of years. So just to add some more context to that, I don't think it's a proviso. I don't think the proviso is the issue right now. I think what we'll have to work through, and we've agreed to obviously to do this, is to help them find the right funding source so that we can put it in again this year.
Okay, would you suggest changing our the language? Maybe we don't include the word proviso.
No, I think it's fine how it is. I just wanted everyone to, I got this information late last week, and like I said, Ron and I talked about it, and I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that it's not so much a fight over any particular proviso. I think what we have on the priority list is fine. I just want everyone to know the background, that the real discussion is finding a permanent way to pay for this going forward so they can make it a permanent change. Just wanted you all to kind of have the info that we had as we knew it. So I think we're good with what we have written, just so you know kind of the background on where some of the conversation's going.
Okay.
And Brad, you may want to talk about number 3 as a part of number 1. I know we did this at our last meeting as well. The TD late shift Uber program really ties back to the trust fund as well. So I think our goal there is not only get the proviso in, but also ensure there are dollars as a part of the Transportation Disadvantage Plan to be able to still fund these type of grant programs.
I think that's a good suggestion, that number 3 be moved up in front of number 2, just to kind of categorize those two together, because they are similar, related to the funding source. But number 3 is essentially just continuing what the state has called mobility enhancement grant funding, and allow the programs that PSTA has been very successful with, our TD late shift program, which provides late night rides for low-income folks to get home from third shift jobs, to continue to be eligible for that funding. And I think there's general support for that by the commission staff, the commission executive director. He was very supportive of that. They allocated a record amount of funding of this mobility enhancement grant funding to PSTA for the program for this fiscal year. So that's sort of, I think, almost to thank the legislators for approving this in the past and to keep it coming. It's very good for us. Okay, let's quickly switch. I'll just cover the Medicaid one, and then we'll talk about electric buses. Number 4, Medicaid. This is an issue that also is affecting PSTA, in that the statewide brokerage system that allocates or provides transportation to Medicaid recipients all across Florida through private, mostly cab operators and other transportation providers, has not done the greatest job in allocating in getting those folks trips. Under federal Medicaid provisions, transportation to and from doctor's appointments or to the pharmacy is a Medicaid eligible expense. It can be free to the Medicaid recipient to go to and from the doctor. But what happens is it's so confusing, and it's brokered out by these national companies that don't have a presence in, like, the Tampa Bay area. They don't provide very good service, and they often don't show up at your door. And the recipients get sick of this, they give up, and they call DART. They call PSTA. And then Pinellas County taxpayers are paying for the trip rather than federal Medicaid dollars paying for it. That's the problem. It's estimated that we're providing $1 million worth of transportation that could be to and from doctor's appointments that could be reimbursed by Medicaid instead of us. But we're not able to get reimbursed by Medicaid when we provide that trip, because we're not eligible to have access to the database of recipients of Medicaid. That's prohibited by the state agency called ACA, and we've been trying to get a meeting with them over the last year to talk to them about this issue. I'm not sure exactly what the solution is to it. Last year there was some relief given by the legislature by kind of indirectly. Uber and Lyft are now eligible providers of Medicaid trips. There hasn't been much evidence that these national brokers have given many of the trips in the Tampa Bay region, or really anywhere in Florida, to Uber and Lyft rides yet, but I think that's going to grow, and that will obviously provide more opportunity for folks to get Medicaid reimbursable trips through Uber and Lyft instead of coming to PSTA, but we haven't seen much of that happening yet. So this is kind of an open-ended one, really to have a discussion with the state agency. Some of the legislators we met with suggested that Representative Jamie Grant serves on a committee I'm not sure if it's a committee or what he serves in some capacity that's supposed to look at ways in which sort of government programs can work better together and integrate better together, so that perhaps he's a key player that might be able to help us really just have access to the database, or access so that we could submit, get reimbursement from Medicaid for trips that we provide that are eligible for such funding. Ron or Alan, you have any other comment on that?
Yeah, Brad, the only comment I would have, and we talked about this a little bit at the last meeting, is I think the first step would be to try to meet with Secretary Mayhew, the Secretary of ACA, to have a conversation about, hey, look, we're having this challenge before we go change state law. Is there a way for you to work with us to ensure that if there are Medicaid eligible trips that we're doing, is there a way to work directly with you potentially to ensure that Medicaid covers, or more importantly, maybe point some of these folks back in the direction of Medicaid to try to work with another provider if they can. We obviously don't want to just put somebody out there in a black hole where they don't have transportation. So, and then we talked about, depending how that conversation goes, is if we needed to, there's a couple ways you could do this. A, there'll be some transportation bills that are moving, we could add it in, but there's always some version of a Medicaid conforming bill. I'm sure this language we're talking about would fit nicely in there potentially. So, but I think the first conversations with Secretary Mayhew. So when you come up in December, I think we have that conversation, see how willing she wants to be helpful. And then from there, we can determine what the next steps may be heading into session.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that, after the last meeting we had, I had a very brief, nothing in depth certainly, but a very brief conversation with Toby Philpott, who's the Chief of Staff over at ACA. And he said he's more than happy to set something up. Obviously, we're not the only one facing this issue, so it's certainly something they're aware of. But I said he's happy to set a meeting up with the right people for us to have that conversation when you all come to town.
Okay, that sounds like a winner.
Are all these people in Tallahassee? They're not in any other part of the state?
Yeah, they're all up here.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
So
they are.
we've got to make a run up there, is what you're saying, just to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, these kind of complex issues, at least what we found out about the transportation disadvantage, and as the two former legislators I think know who are here with us today, maybe step one is for them to do a study of the issue, to commission a study. Now, there's a federal study on this Medicaid brokerage system thing that had a specific case study on the state of Florida that just has been published. So there's a lot of information already out there about what Florida's doing on Medicaid, but maybe that's step one, is just to have folks in the legislature better understand what's going on. Which, you know, I don't know. So that then leads to the final thing, which is electric bus funding. Cover number 5 first, because that actually is a program that's moving along right now, and it's not really something that the legislature, I think, will have that much input on, perhaps, because the deadline for grant applications or request for interest in receiving funds is November 7th. And we're going to be submitting an application on behalf of our community to apply for VW settlement funds by that deadline. And I know, thanks to Natalie for helping us navigate this. I don't know if I saw something that requires the legislature to approve of the funds for the DEP to allocate the funds, so maybe the legislature will be involved. Now, that's why I put it on this list as sort of a backup, just to make sure that those funds do get allocated for...
Brad, can I add comment on that?
Yeah.
So the component that is relevant to the legislature is that on an annual basis, they have a spending level that's authorized by the legislature. So that, for them, the monies that are coming from the trust, they cannot spend them unless they have the spending authority. So that's their largest constraint, is that, for example, this current budget year, 1920, they were only given $15.5 million in authority. So for going forward, their budget request for next year, 2021, they've actually upped that to $67 million. That way, the dollars that will be drawn down through the trust fund can then be allocated out to these projects. So that, it's not so much that the legislature has to approve anything per se on the VW funds, is that the department itself has to have funding, legislative spending authority. And so they have, again, 67 million is what they're seeking this year. So if we were to take a position at any level, if we felt that the legislature and the governor was not going to approve their funding request, we could weigh in there. But at this point, that would be too early to tell. And so that's where that piece comes in.
Okay. Now, $67 million is only about, plus the 15, is only about half of the total amount that the state of Florida is getting.
Correct. So they will not spend all the dollars in 1 year. That would bring them to about the halfway mark of the funds available. And then they would expect to push for additional authority in 21-22 for the remainder of the money.
Oh. Okay. Number 2 on the list is probably our biggest stretch, given this is actually an ask for new money, or maybe it's not state tax dollars, maybe it's some kind of funding from the utility companies itself. But this would be to create a new program that would help fund electric vehicle infrastructure or electric vehicle conversion. There is an existing program, or there was an existing program at the state legislature called the Natural Gas Fuel Fleet Rebate Program. And this, I think, got funding somehow through natural gas providers, the utility companies, and they provided funding for natural gas vehicles, purchase of natural gas vehicles by municipalities. Pinellas County, St. Petersburg, City of St. Petersburg got some funding for natural gas vehicles from this fund. And Senator Brandis indicated that he was working on a electric vehicle bill for this session. So perhaps something similar could be set up for electric vehicles that was previously set up for natural gas vehicles. That's the idea, that there would be some state dollars or some state allocated dollars to electrify some of our buses, or provide the infrastructure for electric buses. Ron, Alan, Natalie, any thoughts on that?
Hello?
Yeah, Brad. Yeah, Brad, I
Sorry,
think sorry, you were on mute. I think the short answer is, I don't think Senator Brandis has decided yet. I think he's working with Senator Hudson and also President Galvano on creating a kind of, I'm not going to call it a new pot, but a pot of money potentially that could be spent on not only this type of project, but also on other innovative transportation-related projects as well. So, so Senator Brandis is aware we have the ask. He's aware that we want to do something. I think we need to be opportunistic to ensure that we're part of the discussion as they kind of create this new program.
Yeah, and we're with him a few times this week, so I have not talked to him about this in probably a little over a week. Just let me mention it to him again this week. I think we have like 3 meetings with him, so at the end of one of those, I'll just put a bug in his ear to see if they've made any progress on exactly what they're looking at doing. My guess is that they haven't. As Ron said, they're probably still in the formation stage, but I'll check in this week since we'll have the opportunity to do that, just to see if something's changed.
Is there any additional documentation or support that we need to provide here for that? That's really a critical component to our plan.
I don't think there is yet. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
No, well, just as Ron was about to say, I don't think there is yet. I think let's wait and see, because there's 10 different ways they could do this. I wouldn't want to put something together that doesn't tie into what their focus may be, so we may have to tailor it to whatever their plan is. I mean, obviously, Ron and I had talked earlier about the corridor bill, and he had heard some things about that. So we just kind of don't know how it's going to roll out yet. I'd hate to have everybody spun up and work on something that isn't really applicable once we see what their plan ends up being. So I'd say let's let them tell us what their strategy is, and then we can tailor our specific information to whatever it is that they have.
All right, good?
Sounds good.
We good?
Before we leave state,
Yeah.
is OPAGA, I mean, is that still a relevant source of reports for folks? Ron or
It is,
Albert?
yeah, they still do APAGA, yeah, they still do APAGA reports
Because
there's
the,
20 of them a week that I think we all get, so.
any legislator can request an APAGA report, and I think that can happen before, during, parallel with the stuff as far as Medicaid reimbursement issue. And I just Googled the APAGA site. The last time there was a review of the Transportation Disadvantage Program was in 1997 by APAGA. Not that it hasn't been reviewed by others, but that's the last time APAGA looked at it. So certainly not a bad time to have them do it again, specifically on this funding issue.
And that's not a bad idea, because in another board meeting where there was a conversation that came up with OPAGA, seems to me that they had changed some of the reporting requirements so that they have to come back within a very much shorter time frame than they used to. So, what do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I think we can definitely ask if one of the members is willing to put in for an APAGA report. It would have to go through the speaker or the president's office, but those are usually, as you said, they're routinely approved. So I wouldn't imagine there's an issue, but we can certainly check in with them and see if that's something they'd like to do.
Okay.
Gina, the OPAGA is Florida Legislature's Office of Program Policy Analysis and Government Accountability. And they're a pretty fair broker of information, just if you want an agency or an issue kind of investigate it a little bit further.
On a complicated issue that nobody can find an answer to, supposedly.
I think Senator LaBella had an OPAGA study done about PSTA.
Yes, he did.
5 or 6 years ago.
And I had one done years ago on our fire service system, fire and EMS.
So it's a report, not a study.
Oh, they do a study. They talk to all the stakeholders, takes them forever. But my understanding is they've speeded up the process.
Now, Commissioner Justice, were you suggesting an OPAGA study on the transportation disadvantage,
Yeah.
formula issue, or the Medicaid, or both?
The Medicaid issue, as far as the ACA database that's costing us $1 million a year, that particular issue.
Okay, did your search indicate that has there ever been an OPAGA study done on Medicaid?
I'm sure there's,
Medicaid transportation, or?
yeah, I'm mixing terms, I
Apples and
apologize.
oranges.
No, nothing's coming up.
That might be a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, nothing's coming up.
And we can use that as an option because, again, typically, as you all know, they're not doing interim studies anymore. They used to have all these committees do interim studies in the off-season. Now they've moved basically to having APAGA do a lot of these studies in the off-season. So depending how our conversation goes with, with ACA, coupled with if we need to do something legislatively, it gives us the opportunity, if needed, to do something in the off season as well. If we need to work, getting a maybe a key member to request a report out of APAGA.
I think it's just one more tool,
Excellent. So with that, if the legislative committee would like to make a recommendation with the modification that we kind of group the recommendations together to put the transportation disadvantage ones together, the electric bus ones together, and then the Medicaid one.
I move that we put them together as you have just suggested.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Okay, do we have our federal partners on the line?
We are here. Yes, you do.
Hey, Harry, welcome, Steve.
Thank you.
So,
Okay.
what's the weather like up there?
It's a beautiful day.
Nice.
Ready for the world? We're ready for the World Series.
Okay.
I have, as you can see, a more pared down list of suggestions for the federal process. Number 1 continues to be capital investment grant funds for our Central Avenue BRT project, which we're making, I think, really good progress at the federal level on. Using 2019 or 2020 funds. That's sort of the a key provision. We're hopeful that we can get an allocation of funds by next summer, using existing, already approved 2019 or 2020 dollars, 2019 dollars preferably, that are already approved. Harry or Steve, do you want to give any insight on that, or any?
No, the only thing I'd say, Brad, is it's a little wordsmithing. When I read this the first time, when I saw capital investment grants, I thought you were talking about the overall federal funding level. You may want to insert secure capital investment grant funds for the Central Avenue BRT. I know it's a minor change, but if you take this to Washington, most people are going to think you're talking about what Congress needs to do in terms of its funding levels.
Right, okay. Right. Number 1 on our list is very specific to PSTA and our project. Number 2 on the list is what you were just talking about, Steve, that overall PSTA would advocate on behalf of the overall program as far as appropriations go. Not having capital investment grants or any transit funding be cut from 2019
Correct.
levels. Okay. Yeah. So number 1 is our specific project. Number 2 is the overall pot of funding.
No, I think that's good.
Okay. And then number 3 is the authorization, the transportation authorization, which I can't remember exactly when that expires, but I think it expires in 2020 sometime. And we would just be an advocate for robust multimodal public transit funding moving forward.
And Brad, just to add to that, the FAST Act, the current authorization, the multi-year bill expires on September 30th of 2020. And in addition to fully funding mass transit programs, I don't know if you want to include a reference to long-term solvency of the Highway Trust Fund, because that's ultimately what's needed to fully fund the transit programs.
Okay. Right.
Harry, long-term, the Highway Trust Fund numbers are decreasing as people move to more fuel-efficient vehicles and so on. Is there any other kind of funding that's in the horizon that will replace the trust fund, the Highway Trust Fund, as revenues diminish?
Well, this is Steve. I'll just jump in real quick, and Harry can add to it. The only thing that is sort of viable that it's not really ready for full implementation next year is the vehicle miles traveled fee. It's being piloted in a couple states, but I don't think anyone thinks it's ready to be applied nationwide for all vehicles. There are a number of other different alternatives, but there aren't any real great alternatives for revenue. And the reason I think we have to make this a priority for our federal legislative platform is without a solution, the Highway Trust Fund will go broke next year, and there's no way around that. It just you could in the last bill 4 years ago they borrowed money from things like the Strategic Oil Petroleum Reserve and from the Federal Reserve. It's going to require many billions of dollars to be able to do that, and they're going to have to figure out a way to address it. And there is no simple solution other than, if they don't want to bite the bullet and raise the gas taxes, they have to come up with something else.
So Steve, to that point, it seems to me that this is a bigger than just the federal government problem, because our county is in the same fix. Our Highway Trust Fund goes to zero in 2022. So clearly, we can't keep on doing what we've been doing. That is not working. How do we get that message out to everybody?
Well, I think I'll just say real quickly that that's consistent with a federal situation, and I think the fact that it's happening locally probably will resonate with the delegation, the congressional delegation, because they understand both locally and federally that something needs to be done.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond transit, Commissioner. It's Harry. This is all the highway programs, everything. It's not just the transit programs. So there are lots of lots of players that are following this.
Well, it'd be nice if they followed it and put some action behind it. I mean, we can talk about it all day long, but as you know, until they're ready to move forward with some positive action, it isn't gonna get fixed.
Yeah, well, that's why the infrastructure bill broke down all those discussions, because everybody wanted to put more money in infrastructure, but they couldn't figure out how to pay for it. So, and some members of Congress have been out there proposing these things that Steve talked about, the miles traveled, or raising the gas tax, or raising the gas tax and indexing it so it continues to go up with inflation every year. That's another option too. And then, Steve, there was a proposal, I think, to try and figure out how to tax electric vehicles too.
Yeah, there is, and it's going to be an issue that will be included in any kind of legislation next year. But certainly that's just enough to cover those vehicles, not enough to replenish the trust fund.
Right.
Well,
So, Brad, on your federal agenda, we did not include this year the counting the miles for TNC ridership, so you get credit for those. Did you want to add that to this agenda?
yeah, I think we should.
Yeah.
Didn't we have it on there last year?
We did.
We did, and that's certainly part of the authorization discussion as well.
And Brad, that may have gotten tougher last week. Steve, you want to tell them about the hearing last week?
Well, I just was going to say the chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which will have to reauthorize this legislation we talked about, is essentially going to war with Uber and Lyft because there are some real concerns that he and others on the committee have expressed about the TNCs in terms of their background checks and their unwillingness to come forward and talk about it. They refused to testify last week at a hearing. So he fired off like an 8 or 9 page letter of questions to them, basically asking them why they're opposing all these different things that need to be done to protect the safety of passengers. So it is going to be, there may be some interest in trying to do something if we can get the Senate involved, but I think it's going to be a very steep hill in the House right now because of the committee chairman's opposition to where the TNCs are.
Yeah. Interesting. I also saw an article that there's a proposal in the Los Angeles area to require Uber and Lyft drivers to be paid $30 an hour. Pretty good. Pretty good job.
They'll price themselves out of the marketplace if they do that.
Yes, they will.
Maybe
Well,
maybe that's the idea.
It may be. Well, that being said, we were able, well, not that this counts for anything, but in the APTA's reauthorization proposal, so the transit folks, we were able to get counting the rides included, as long as they benefited public transportation. As long as the services using TNCs or other innovative modes were benefiting public transportation services, that's being proposed. And I know the last time we were in Washington, we still got a fairly favorable discussion, feedback from the Senate banking folks to this idea. So I don't know. I understand that the House maybe is going to war with them now, so maybe things have changed, but
well, certainly, I think Harry's point about adding it to the federal agenda is worthwhile, and the commissioner has suggested that as well. I just wanted to highlight the fact that there are some bumps on the road that have nothing to do with us.
right.
And then, Brad, the only other item that we had on past agendas related to autonomous vehicles. I know you all are looking at that as a potential, and I don't know, Steve. I mean, the autonomous vehicle issue runs across multiple committees in Congress, and so I doubt they're going to address that in the highway bill. Maybe Steve, you know more, but I don't know if you want to add that onto your agenda or not. But Congress is trying to, at least related to autonomous vehicles for cars, they tried in the last Congress. They thought they were going to get a bill, and they didn't quite get there. So they're looking at it again this Congress. Or you're looking more at the bus side of the autonomous vehicle than you are the car side, but I don't know if you want to add that back on or not.
Harry, do you believe that autonomous buses will be treated in some different way than autonomous cars?
Yes, possibly, because the buses are regulated by the National Highway Safety Traffic Administration, NHTSA, and so that's where, we've been talking about the Gainesville runaround.
Yeah.
They've been trying to get a NHTSA permit to run an autonomous route in Gainesville, and it's just been a nightmare for them bureaucratically. So I don't, if you're seriously thinking about running a autonomous bus project, you're going to probably need some federal intervention to figure out a permitting process or some kind of regulatory authority to allow you to do that. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of time on a lot of bureaucracy. So, I mean, it may not be an issue it may be an issue worth raising with the Congress and just talking about it as others look to do it. Steve, I don't know, you have any thoughts on that one?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't. I have nothing important to add other than I'm not sure autonomous vehicles will be, there's going to be legislation that will happen, but I'm not sure the industry is moving ahead as quickly as people originally thought. I've heard from a number of different manufacturers that they're looking at 5 to 10 years instead of a couple of years down the road.
Even Senator Brandis told me that.
Yeah.
Wow.
I know, which is shocking to hear him say that.
Steve, Brad, my only other comment about the agenda, and we talk about transit funding in general, do we need to specify, you all have had an interest in and been successful in low-no grants for your electric buses and the TIG program and some of those. I assume we're covering that under the broad maintain or increase funding for FTA appropriations, but did you want to specify anything more about some of the specific things, the sandbox program, some of the ones you guys have benefited from in the past?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I think leaving it broad to cover all those items, and then we'll highlight all those programs that we've been very successful with, and thankful that they've appropriated in the past. Yeah. There's the one other issue that I think, I don't know if the PSTA board really has an opinion about, but it's something that I know Congress is dealing with right now, is whether or not buses purchased with buses that have a affiliation with a Chinese ownership, should they be allowed or not? But I think that'll be worked out in some way.
Right, I think that issue is going to be resolved before the end of this year in the current legislation, because it's pretty clear that in our meeting with Jennifer the other day, when you were Jen DC, when you were up here the other day, she was pretty clear in saying that she thought the final bill was going to prohibit federal funds from being used to purchase Chinese buses.
Well, spoken like a good person who works for the Senate, because that's the Senate's position. The House position is just the rail cars, and
Yeah.
so far allows buses, thanks to Representative McCarthy being congressman from that district where the factory is.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Maybe we're getting into the weeds a little bit, but what about parts and components for existing buses that we already own that are made by Chinese manufacturers?
Well, so far, the legislation just is very broad. It says rolling stock, and it would be prospective. So I think it would be left up to FDA to figure out how they would implement it, in terms of whether or not that would apply to replacement parts.
Yeah. Well, I said this the other day in a meeting. It makes us look like we bought a Nash Rambler, but maybe nobody knows what a Nash Rambler is.
Yeah.
So,
I do.
Yeah.
I'm Googling it.
Yeah. So we're in a kind of a bind in that situation with what we already acquired.
I do know just some more weed information about the electric buses. The biggest problem we had with and we resolved it, our maintenance guys resolved it expertly, was a component of the BYD buses that was actually made in Germany. And, made in America, I think, but from a German company. was an American factory, and so they were dealing with German engineers. The vehicle comes from, it's an international vehicle. If you want to get down to it. But anyway, so we'll leave that off the list. So what I have now is a federal legislative priority list, which is 1, to secure capital investment grant funds for the Central Avenue BRT. Number 2, maintain or increase federal transit appropriations in 2020 compared to 2019. And number 3, transportation authorization that fully funds mass transit programs, including a long-term solution of the Highway Trust Fund. And maybe either a subset under that, or a number 4 would be counting rides for complementary, innovative transportation modes. And number 5 would be, I don't know what the right wording is, streamlined approvals of autonomous vehicle programs, autonomous vehicle pilot programs.
Or maybe establishment of a regulatory process for implementing AV bus projects or something like that.
Okay.
Okay,
So I knew you guys wouldn't like to have a smaller legislative agenda than the state guys. So now we're at 5 and 5. Sounds good.
All right.
so for the good of the order, is there any other information we need to talk about?
Harry or Steve, if you want to give any other updates on what's going on with the federal.
Are we gonna have a shutdown, or we're not gonna have a shutdown?
Well, I wouldn't put any money down on it. As you know, the House has passed 10 of the 12 appropriations bills. The Senate hasn't passed any, and the Senate is going to try and pass 2 packages of bills this week potentially that would cover 9 of the 12 bills. So they're going to give it a try. Transportation is one of the bills in one of the packages. I don't know. It's unclear at this point whether they'll be able to pass them or not, because it requires 60 votes in the Senate, and there are only 53 Republicans. So they have to get at least 7 Democrats to go along with passing these bills, and they're currently not very happy with some of the spending limits that are placed on the bills. So it's unclear what's going to happen. It is pretty clear they're going to have to pass another continuing resolution. The current funding resolution expires on November 21st. My guess is they're going to have to pass another one into December to give them more time to figure out what they want to do. Steve, is that accurate from what you're hearing?
Yeah, I think that's right.
So I don't think there'll be a shutdown, at least in this go-around before Christmas. But if it drags out, the problem, if it continues to drag out and they can't get action in the Senate, Senator Shelby, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, has been talking about the potential for a full year-long continuing funding resolution, which I don't know, Steve, how FTA would fare under that if they wind up in an automatic funding resolution for the full year. Does that help or hurt FTA? I'm not sure.
It would help FTA because the formula funds would pretty much be the same. There would be the formula funds are supposed to slightly increase under the FAST Act, but it wouldn't be substantial. And then the Capital Investment Grant Program was funded at $2.55 billion last year, which is higher than either the House or Senate is right now. So it would be good for FTA.
So in that case, a full year continuing resolution, Commissioner, might actually be, in this small area at least, good for you, but not good for the rest of the government.
Well, I have a great suggestion. How about we just stop paying the senators until they start working?
You want to add that as item 6 on your federal agenda?
I think we ought to put it right up at number 1.
Jeez.
I bet you that would, you know,
Well, I did include in your packets this apt little script for you to call your senator.
I've called my senators so many times this last month, I can't, they've got my, I've got them on speed dial. I don't think they like my message.
So would the committee like to recommend this as amended federal legislative priorities?
Yes,
to
what
the
is the
full-
wishes of the committee? Heather,
So
you haven't
moved.
said anything since we got here.
Second.
I was just gonna motion that.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
You're welcome. And it's been seconded, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Anything else? Gentlemen,
Well,
on the phone?
I have a question. What are we doing as far as visits to key senators and congresspeople to move these things along? Are we in contact with them on a regular basis? Would it be beneficial for us to come up and chat with them there, or better to meet them in their local offices here? What are your suggestions?
We just had a good round of meetings in September with the Florida delegation, including Congressman Diaz-Balart, who the House, he's the principal Floridian who's handling transportation issues on the Appropriations Committee for the House. So we had good meetings with them. We met with Senator Rubio and Senator Scott's offices, so I think we had a good round of meetings there. Brad, I don't know, we talked briefly about whether the Florida Transit Association was going to engage via letter or something to our senators and to Mario Diaz-Balart, maybe our appropriators on the funding issue. Is that something that might be the FTA might want to do?
I'll ask. I'm sure they would be supportive of at least, the active position, but I'll see if they're going to be doing anything about specifically with the federal level. I know that they're gearing up on the states stuff. Let me ask about that. As far as federal activities, our bus rapid transit project is moving along such that we believe, or the strategy that I know I've worked with Harry and Steve on, is that probably next month, sometime starting in November, we would try to activate some of our legislative delegation to make some calls and over to the federal U.S. Department of Transportation to advocate for funding for the BRT, and so I think that's fairly well set. As Harry said, we had a good set of meetings with them. Right now, our next trip to Washington, D.C. is probably not going to be until the springtime. At least that's what it's looking like. I'm not sure if there's really of much value to heading there again in person, but if Harry or Steve think otherwise, certainly don't want to go down up there if it's shut down. And then at the state level, we're planning on going one time during a committee week and one time during the session. And the committee week's trip is December 9th and 10th. Thanks to Commissioner Team Driscoll here for agreeing to go. Maybe Commissioner Gracie and Commissioner Dan Saraki has agreed to go. And advocate on behalf of this, as long as the PSTA board approves it on Wednesday, this state agenda. And then we'll go back, I think the next trip is a little bit late in the session in late February, if I recall. So that's the plan there. Commissioner Buckley. So-
We're going up in January. Are you coming then?
I have it on my calendar.
Bye, guys.
What's in January? Is it with a different group?
It's the Hillsborough, Pinellas, Pasco
Or state?
Day on the Hill.
That is,
I think Chambers and.
right at the beginning of the
cities
session,
and-
right?
January 28th, 29th.
Oh, 28, 29? don't see it. Is it really 28, 29? That's right.
I take that back. January 15th is Pinellas County Day.
Yeah, I thought it was.
January 28th is Florida Association of Counties Day. That's what I have.
January 15th is Pinellas?
Pinellas Day.
I like it.
That's what they called it back in the 80s.
We're bringing it back.
Well, I'll talk to Ron and see if they got yet another trip by the PSTA folks to lovely Tallahassee would be beneficial or not. Yeah, because our trip during the session is not scheduled till when? February.
It's March.
March.
4th and 5th.
March 4 and 5, yeah. Yeah.
When is session over this year?
Right around then, I think.
Is that the last week?
Well, so I'm trying to remember that email with the weeks on it.
You guys know when's the best time for us to go? Early or late?
Yes.
Before conference starts, because once conference starts, it's a pretty done deal.
Right.
Legislative session convenes on January 14th, so the day before Pinellas Day. I don't see the last day.
Somebody's typing away.
I don't know.
Yeah, like on an old school. I'm expecting to hear the
Sounds
little
like-
return.
Sounds like a typewriter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Charlie, who organizes Pinellas Day?
On our staff is Brian Lowak, but there's Pinellas, there's someone on each staff, and then the chambers are engaged. And I know it's different than St. Pete Day.
Yes, I'm interested in this one.
So is it really all three counties are gonna go?
But the idea is to, the South Florida delegations all go as a block to Tallahassee. And in strength, the numbers give you strength.
Yeah.
And so the idea was that we could all go the same day, meet with our legislators. I don't really know what all the plans are. They've changed a bit since Lou first brought the idea forward, I think.
March 13th is
Of
last
course,
day of
our-
session.
County attorney had to get into it and mess with the whole original plan. But,
Yeah, those laws are so pesky, man.
anyway, that was the idea, that we could pick those issues that we have a regional focus on. Transportation, maybe water, I don't know, flood.
Yeah.
Sea level rise, climate change. Yeah. That we all share.
So that ties in with our electric vehicles.
Yeah.
The idea of reducing
The carbon
emissions.
footprint.
Emissions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so,
All right.
Anything else for the good of the order?
Have there been any discussions with Duke Energy about electric vehicle infrastructure
Yes.
partnership?
We're actually working with them right now on
Should I?
well, they've given us some grants for some electric vehicle charging. They paid for our charging equipment that we have here at the PSTA's facility for the buses. And
They do the
I
liberal
haven't-
ones?
What?
Do they do the ones for the liberal?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
that's the
going
one. And then
He wants to go.
they are working with our engineers on developing a plan for converting the whole fleet.
I went,
What it'll take as far as infrastructure goes.
Are we adjourned, or, Madam
yes,
Chair?
Chair.
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
Yeah, that's good.
Good to see you, my friend.
Always
Duke
Joseph.
has been pretty good about
Man, Charlie's out here quick.
installing charging stations for regular cars
Yeah.
all over the city. And they reached out to me at one point, I connected.
You guys
them
gonna
with
have, what's your groundbreaking?
condos and
Oh,
apartment
geez,
buildings to have them
we're only
put
in
in
schematic
parking
design, so
garages.
probably another
So
2
there's
years.
been private
Oh,
work that they do
okay.
there.
All right.